AIs, if you have a superintelligence, it creates superintelligence, broadly speaking. It can make many types of weapons research. You could have some breakthroughs in there, and that could stabilize things. Now, we could come up with a scheme for a good anti-ballistic missile system, which reduces adversaries' second strike capabilities, which totally gets rid of mutual assured destruction, which is totally destabilizing.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Kevin Frazier, the AI Innovation and Law Fellow at the UT Austin School of Law and a contributing editor at Lawfare. Joined by Dan Hendrycks, Director of the Center for AI Safety.
Torts will add some restrictions to these models compared to where they are now, but I think that's totally reasonable and what you would need for longer-term economic stability.
Today, we're discussing his paper, Superintelligence Strategy, co-authored with former Google CEO Eric Schmidt and Scale AI CEO Alexandr Wang. As AI capabilities accelerate, we're not just talking about automation or economic shifts. We're facing potential paradigm shifts in military deterrence, cyber conflict, and global power dynamics. Some experts argue that an AI arms race is beginning to resemble the nuclear age, but with even greater unpredictability. Our guest today has taken that analogy a step further, introducing a provocative new concept, mutual assured AI malfunction, or MAME, a deterrence regime where great powers might sabotage each other's AI advances rather than risk unilateral domination or catastrophic loss of control. Dan and his co-authors, Eric Schmidt and Alexandr Wang, argue that we need a structured approach to superintelligence strategy, drawing on historical lessons from nuclear deterrence, non-proliferation, and technological competition. So, Dan, there's so much to unpack there. But one thing I want to start with is why now? Why did you and Eric and Alexandr choose this moment to release Superintelligence Strategy?
Well, great question. I think we're entering a different paradigm, the reasoning paradigm of AI. So they're improving quite rapidly behind the scenes, and we're seeing some of that publicly. But basically, it's improvement in software engineering and other STEM skills and other domains that require a lot of reasoning is going so quickly. So it could be the case that even in the middle of the year, AI becomes much more salient. So when people are thinking, what should we do? There's at least something lying around. So that's some of the motivation, as well as the competition between the US and China has become substantially more close. So last year, there's a strategy proposed to have a Manhattan Project where the US just, increases its lead, and then they build superintelligence, and then they get to tell all the other countries what to do because that gives them a monopoly on intelligence and potentially a strategic monopoly on power. So consequently, this strategy of doing a Manhattan Project of, we'll just race ahead of them isn't looking like that'll be as robust. We can't assume that one will have a substantial lead over the other.
The moat is gone, so to speak. And I think perhaps the drawbridge is up too after the Paris AI Action Summit, where Vice President Vance made clear that, yes, we are racing ahead. And so it's hard not to read that paper in light of these racing dynamics. And with superintelligence strategy in mind, we have so many conversations about AGI, artificial general intelligence, to transformative AI. What does superintelligence mean with respect to these other terms, and how should we think about it?
Yeah, great question. So maybe let's just first take, what is AGI? AGI, people define this differently. Some people would say, when it can do the things that a typical person can do, intellectual tasks or digital types of tasks, virtual ones. That's a definition, but it keeps changing. Transformative AI is often meaning when there's high economic impact. So it's not just, do you have the technology, but is it diffused? Because it sometimes there might be a lot of red tape that limits diffusion, or procurement processes in the government may slow down diffusion substantially. And superintelligence is when it's basically vastly better than all the world's experts. It's just at everything intellectually. So it's not just at human level, it's for virtually everything. It's just way, way, way better. Weapons research, AI research, running a business, everything. Those are three different distinctions. I'd submit a fourth that I think for in the coming years, it's sometimes more useful to look at specific capabilities. When is an AI capable of doing a particular risky thing? So does it have expert level virology capabilities? That's quite relevant because that can be used for both good and bad. That's very dual use. Or cyber capabilities for cyber attacks. So those come at different times, those capabilities. So it's somewhat difficult to think about terms like AGI because they're all encompassing. It can be very good in some ways and very bad in others. The intelligence frontier is quite jagged. So it would not surprise me if AIs are publishing papers or doing the heavy lifting and publishing mathematics papers before I have a robot that can fold my laundry at home and have that diffuse throughout the economy. So thinking of it in all or nothing way tends to get people caught up. And I think for the geopolitics of this and for when we need to be coordinating, it's often useful to speak about specific capabilities. But I do think these notions are all useful, including the notion of superintelligence, because it's defined in a way that if you actually do get it, that would be plausibly quite destabilizing.
Yeah, and what I think is really valuable about this framing of superintelligence versus AGI is it seems like everyone wants to debate precisely when and how we may reach AGI. But to your point, if we have a superintelligent system with respect to cyber or with respect to creating biological weapons, that's all we need to be concerned about to then trigger this strategy of mutual assured AI malfunction. And so,
well, it would depend. It's for some different capabilities there. So for bio would be very risky from rogue actors, but be less interesting to, say, a superpower for the same reason that we have the Biological Weapons Convention, that these are chemical and biological weapons are poor man's atom bombs, so to speak. And so it would make sense for countries to or superpowers to cooperate so that those destructive capabilities are not widely proliferated, because rogue actors could then more easily threaten their survival. So for those capabilities, those are relevant for trying to coordinate. But in terms of incentivizing sabotage, I don't think those would necessarily do that. Maybe some form of cyber could, but I think other types of capabilities could be more destabilizing, like AIs that help make oceans more transparent so that you can see where nuclear submarines are, know where the mobile launchers are, or AIs. If you have a superintelligence, it creates superintelligence, broadly speaking. It can make many types of weapons research. You could have some breakthroughs in there, and that could destabilize things. Now we could come up with a scheme for a good anti-ballistic missile system, which reduces adversaries' second strike capabilities, which totally gets rid of mutual assured destruction, which is totally destabilizing. So those are all possibilities with a superintelligence. And so you need to be betting that actually we've kind of explored technology to its fullest, and there aren't going to be much returns from extra intelligence, and there won't be breakthroughs that are destabilizing is what you would need to be betting on if a superintelligence is achieved, and if you're thinking it's not going to be destabilizing, which I think is not something people will buy. So
Right. So thinking of this term, mutual assured AI malfunction, obviously folks are probably quickly drawn to the idea of mutual assured destruction. What is the nexus between these two terms, and what is the distinction that you want to draw and emphasize with MAME as opposed to MAD?
Yeah, so I largely use the acronym just to allude to MAD. There are, of course, many differences. This isn't just a repeat of nuclear history. I mean, I'm not advocating for a Manhattan Project, for instance, and I think that it would just be extremely escalatory. You can't do a Manhattan Project secretly in today's day and age. You can't build $1 trillion data center out in the desert. And like there's these things called satellites, and like people would notice if several hundred top researchers are suddenly missing. Like this.
I don't know, Dan. Have you been watching Paradise on Hulu? I mean, you just blow up a rocky mountain and dig a big hole, and there you go. You put a data center down there.
Yeah. So there are some disanalogies. We'll primarily throughout the paper be treating this as a potentially catastrophic dual use technology, because that's what it is. It is dual use. And definitionally, it is potentially catastrophic. If it's expert level in virology, if it has these sorts of cyber capabilities, that's potentially catastrophic. And it has both civilian applications and weapons applications. And so I think seeing what the case was for chem and bio and nuclear, which were potentially catastrophic dual-use technologies, we had to do a game of managing, of capturing the civilian benefits for energy or for products or for healthcare, and reducing the downsides from the weaponization part of it. I think returning to MAME versus MAD, I think there's a deterrence regime. We have deterrence regimes for a lot of things, for nuclear, but also for cyber attacks on critical infrastructure between superpowers, meaning destructive ones. Like China won't or is not taking down a power grid. They could. It would not be the most difficult thing for them to do, but we would probably do the same back to them. And trying to destroy each other's economies. Like there's so much economic interdependence or complex interdependence that's not very incentive compatible. And with nuclear as well, there's substantial deterrence to have people stave off from doing things that would just collectively harm everybody else. So in the case of AI, if there is an opportunity to get superintelligence, if one's on the verge of it, if one were to initiate a process such that one might have it, say, a year later, this process could look like the following. Imagine that you've got an AI that can do AI research really well. Then you can make, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 copies of these things and run them in parallel. So OpenAI maybe has got like 200 or so researchers. Now they've got 100,000 world-class ones. Wow. And they're operating at 100 times the speed of a normal human. They can work around the clock. That can be quite explosive. This isn't a new point. This is a point many, many decades old. People like Alan Turing and others pointed this out. And others have for years said, that this would be quite explosive, potentially, an intelligence explosion. The top three most cited AI researchers, that is number one, number two, number three in terms of citations, Bengio, Hinton, and Elias Skeever all think that you might lose control of this process. That would put lots of other states at risk, so they wouldn't like the sound of that. But if a state does successfully control it, that would also be something that would threaten their survival, because then they could use it against them and potentially reduce their second strike capability. So it could be quite disruptive and destabilizing. And so I think that states wouldn't get away with that. As AI becomes more salient, then states would think to deter this type of possibility and forestall it unless it were done under more agreeable conditions. That is, with like clearer benefit sharing or something more multilateral, but that would of course be much later on. So that's sort of the gist of it. But all the analogy to MAD is just pointing at there's shared vulnerabilities as there is for critical infrastructure and for financial systems too. So it's a broader phenomenon. I think fairly precedent. I think we'll just see a similar thing for AI.
And I think when folks read your paper, even the kind of layperson version, you all do a great job. You have a layperson version and an expert version, which I love, and I hope more people follow, because we should all be having these conversations. But I will admit, anytime in a paper you see a game theory diagram come in, I think a lot of people are like, all right, well, Dan, sorry, you lost me. I'm not going back to Economics 301. But I do just want to highlight that you all have some very practical ideas of what MAME would actually manifest in. So can you walk us through, for example, why would we want nations to move their data centers outside of urban areas? What does that have to do with MAME as a theory? And maybe describe some more practical steps you see.
Yeah. So imagine that states were wanting to create credible deterrence. They want the deterrence to be credible, and they want it to be minimally escalatory as well. An extremely escalatory thing would be a kinetic strike. You don't need that, though, by default. You can just disable the surrounding power plant. If the surrounding power plant is affecting cities, this would be much more irritating. So in the nuclear age, there's the concept of city avoidance, where later on it was, let's just have our nuclear weapons pointed at each other's military bases instead of at each other's cities initially. That was a good idea. So it would be nice if we would have sort of city avoidance for this. so that mutually assured AI malfunction isn't sort of mutually assured human destruction. You don't want to overlap between those. You want it to be more surgical. So that's an example type of thing that states could do to reduce the escalation potential of sabotage, given that they will have incentives to make a conditional threat of sabotage against each other. There are other things that states could do, such as increase their espionage programs of each other's projects. I don't think China really would need to. The US is basically an open book in terms of AI. I mean, here's how they could do it. You can just do a 0-day on Slack. Okay, the Slack, that workspace communications thing. And they can see basically everything that's going on. Very easy. And so that would get you XAI, that would get you OpenAI, that would get you Anthropic, that would get you Google DeepMind. They also have, there's a double-digit percentage of the top researchers at all of these organizations are Chinese nationals, and they are extortable. This isn't saying, oh, they're spies from the beginning. I'm not saying that, but they're extortable. They have family back home. Whenever they go back home, it might be a condition before they can leave if they divulge some stuff. So it's the information security, I don't think, is going to be fixed in that way, but it would make sense for the U.S. to improve its ability to spy on programs abroad, as well as develop cyber attacks for the data centers and for the surrounding power plants to make the deterrent more credible, so that one doesn't need to resort to more hostile actions such as kinetic strikes, which I think would be pretty needless. Now, I should note that when I'm describing this, I'm describing where the world might be at later. I'm not saying that currently China's talking about this sort of thing. I mean, the paper's new. I mean, it came out just very recently. So this, I don't think, was on their radar. I'm not describing that this is how they're thinking and here's the first introduction of the paper. So I think that AI will become more salient this year as there's maybe some big AI agent advance. And then people start thinking through the implications and becoming more important decision makers will be convinced of what my co-author Eric Schmidt calls the San Francisco school. This school that AI is, very powerful AI is potentially this decade, and mass automation or huge automation waves is potentially this decade. Not something that's very far off, but potentially on the horizon. Even in the next few years, you could get AGI, so to speak. So I think more decision makers will be buying into the San Francisco school later. Whenever that happens, then I think the strategic implications would be that a potential intelligence explosion giving you a superintelligence, or some really rapid AI research and development giving you a superintelligence, is something that we're not going to let one of each other do, because that could suddenly alter the balance of power in a destabilizing way. And so it would be prevented.
We're speaking in mid-March, right after the request for information for the AI action plan closed. And I'm hoping that somebody included in their submission, hey, Slack, you need to really bolster your cyber defenses.
No, I don't. Whoa, wait. I don't know if I was not claiming that. Therefore, the companies should be trying to improve their infosec substantially to be state-proof. The reason is I don't think that's very tractable. Are we going to fire all the Chinese nationals? I think that would totally undermine U.S. competitiveness. Are we going to require all the people to get security clearances as well? So I think you just get rid of your workforce and then transplant them in some desert or have them work out of a skiff. And so I just don't really see that type of thing happening. So what happened in the nuclear age is things like the Open Skies Treaty, where actually for stabilizing things, they allowed mutual inspection. They reduced information problems and didn't try keeping things some select things as secret from each other to improve stability. So I think very strong state level proof or superpower proof information security, if you'd work in it, would be very difficult, would take many years, would undermine your competitiveness, and would also further, I think, make things less stable as it happens. So there are other routes. You'd also need to call an iPhone to, reduce the 0 days there. You could just spy on some key decision makers on their iPhones, and that'd be another way you could get a sense of what's going on. But yeah.
So listeners may be thinking, okay, Dan, I'm bought in. You've outlined this idea of MAME and called a lot on states to think through these specific escalatory steps, making sure we don't get too high on the retaliatory measures too quickly. They may be thinking, what's the responsibility of the labs here? Do you all call on the labs to have any role in maybe scaling things back or slowing things down? Or are these racing dynamics between the companies, between these countries, something that's kind of just baked into the idea of MAME being a useful strategy or a necessary strategy?
I'm assuming the competition will increase at the speed that the companies can proceed at. So I'm not thinking they're going to voluntarily halt. There instead is channeling competition later stage into other domains. So instead of competing to have the first to have superintelligence, should be totally destabilizing, you wouldn't get away with it. They can compete in other things, like they could compete in robotics for their economy. They can compete in making AI chips. They can, they can compete in drones or what have you. So there are many axes for competition, but the competition doesn't look like the destabilizing sort. So there's competition between the U.S. and Soviet Union, but they would end up having agreements, and they weren't trying to get a nuclear monopoly relative to the other. Later on, when both of them had it, this wasn't so it was just a focus of containment. And with China, I think it's just strategic competition and continued strategic competition, but avoiding things that could destabilize that competition. Now, for companies, so what are they to do? I think clarifying, or I think they should, have to test their models for malicious use applications. That seems like it takes like a week or something like that before the release. This is not adding the safeguards are pretty easy for the catastrophic forms of malicious use, like bio safeguards. So I currently think for chatbot safety, and I speak as advisor for XAI, so we have our risk management framework, and I don't think it's very difficult to implement as it happens. So I think the claim that there's a huge tension is overwrought between competitiveness and safety. Adding the safeguards is pretty easy. Like if people think it's not, it's probably because they just don't know what they're doing. That said, this could change later. Imagine we get AI agents. There could actually be some trade-off between getting the technologies out there as quickly as possible for everybody, in between diffusion and safety, largely due to torts. So if AI agents can scurry around on people's behalf, and if AI companies get their way, that, we have no responsibility for what people instruct our agents. If they tell them to go harass someone or go hack or something, we although it was on our server and we built the technology, we had nothing to do with it. There will actually be some trade-off from tort law, which will put some restrictions on it and make them have to, watch things more carefully. This, might mean that the costs will go up a bit because they're going to try and shift that liability onto an AI insurance company or something like that. So torts will add some restrictions to these models compared to where they are now, but I think that's totally reasonable and what you would need for longer-term economic stability. But there's a potential tension, but I think it's pretty reasonable if AIs are having to abide by the reasonable person standard if they're acting as a fiduciary on behalf of individual people.
So we've analyzed one part of the three-pronged superintelligence strategy, deterrence via MAME, but you all also discuss non-proliferation and competitiveness. I wanted to drill down a little bit more on non-proliferation. What does that mean in this context, and why do you think this is an important part of that overall strategy?
Yeah. So for other potentially catastrophic dual-use technologies, chem, bio, nuclear, there was some precedence of inspection and making sure it's not the inputs to create the weaponized versions of those are restricted. You've got the U.S. select agents list. You've got the Australia groups, Schedule 1 chemicals, for instance, and you have the IAEA and others that do verification for the application of fissile materials. So this is a pretty common thing. And I think for AI as well, you would want safeguards, making sure you're not proliferating the capabilities, like imagine in the future extreme cyber capabilities, to random rogue actors, because cyber offense or cyber attacks are offense dominant with respect to critical infrastructure or extremely high virology capabilities, and non-proliferation of rogue actor or two rogue actors of the things that can make those sorts of capabilities, namely AI chips. And these AI chips are, $30,000 plus a piece. So it's just like don't sell it to them. Let's make sure we know where the AI chips are at. And I think this is a place where superpowers can coordinate, such as the U.S. and China. That I don't think it serves either of their interests to proliferate those sorts of capabilities to rogue actors. Rogue actors I'm using as a shorthand for like imprudent or like terrorists, or ones without self-preservation property, or ones that are not particularly prudent or rational.
Right. And just to press on that for a second, though, about whether or not, for example, China might have an interest, one could argue, in, I don't know, allowing some pretty advanced AI systems to make their way into the hands of, let's say, some bad actors, some non-state actors who want to wreak havoc in the Middle East and therefore draw the U.S. into a Middle East conflict. Is that a potential threat scenario that you think has some that might detract from that sort of coordination between China and the U.S.?
So this is why it's useful to think about specific capabilities here. So for like bio, I don't see why that would be an incentive of theirs, because those can evolve. I think China's particularly vulnerable, relatively speaking, given the homogeneity of their population, to bioweapons relative to more diverse countries like the U.S., which is an extremely grim thing to talk about. But that's bioweapons. It's a real horror show to think about. But it could depend. I think in terms of its incentive compatibility, and I think it'd be probably pretty imprudent, given that a lot of the advanced capabilities are very tangled up with each other. So it'd be difficult for strategically enabling them and get proliferating some of the capabilities to them while not others. So I don't quite see that, but it'd be an interesting thread to pull on. But I think it's probably not the most concerning compared to.
We'll save it for a future tabletop exercise. But for now, I'm curious, you release this paper with Eric Schmidt, with Alexandr, Wang, certainly folks that other people are aware of. Is your phone just blowing up? Are senators texting you, thanks, Dan, we've got MAME now, it's all figured out? Or what's the reception been like?
I think the reception in the national security establishment has been good among people who are interested in AI stuff. Of course, there are people who are like AI, or what's the hype, or something like that, and so there's nothing worth taking seriously there. And I think that will just not be increasingly harder and harder to defend position as time goes on. But among people who are more into this, I think the previous state-of-the-art strategy was the sort of Manhattan Project, which had just a lot of flaws and is looking too late and would be extremely escalatory. Is the lowest impact that it would have, and the highest would be hastening other states' demise or humanity's demise. It's a really risky business. So I think it's a very clear improvement over that. So I was in DC speaking to people about it last week, and at the relevant places like in the Eisenhower building and so on. And so it seems. I think the main thing is socializing it, and then there's some moment where the salience of AI has increased, and that's the main thing lying around, and it's well understood, and confusions are taken care of beforehand. So
is it your assessment that generally policymakers in DC are still lacking a little bit of nuance in diving into the specifics of the threats posed by AI, where maybe that sort of SF school of AGI's coming, superintelligence is coming, that message hasn't reached the Hill in a meaningful way?
So I would definitely distinguish between different agencies and different parts of government. So I think Congress, for instance, is generally more behind on this, and it's a lot harder for them to do stuff in terms of the executive office of the president, or we'll say the White House and surrounding parties. I think they're generally more technically with the program. If they're handling tech, they know this stuff fairly well. I think in the National Security Council in the prior administration as well was very plugged into AI and Many of their key people assigned were roughly in the San Francisco school, so to speak. Yeah, I mean, I'm very optimistic currently about the competence on the geopolitics of AI of the current administration. Different parts of different agencies that aren't really supposed to be on top of AI. I think a lot of them, still don't know as much, but I think a lot of the key actors do.
And a prominent part of the paper centers on the idea of compute governance. And with respect to that, I think there's a connection to things like chip manufacturing at home, domestic chip manufacturing. Are you concerned about some of the pivots potentially away from the CHIPS Act, for example, diminishing the sort of political and financial support for domesticating US production of chips right here in Arizona, for example, and elsewhere?
So the China spends on the order of a CHIPS Act a year, so roughly 50 billion in increasing their domestic semiconductor manufacturing capabilities. I think if China invades, blockades Taiwan, there goes the US's compute advantage. Right now, in terms of the competition between them, they're roughly tied on pretty much all axes. Like they've got similar models, they both have access to the internet to scrapes, they've got similar data, similar quantities of data that they have access to for text data. China has somewhat of an energy edge because they can build power plants and things like that more quickly, but that's not necessarily the most decisive factor. And the US's main advantage is on chips and compute, AI chips. So because 90+% of the value add of the AI chip supply chain is in Western allied countries. But the endpoint of the supply chain is in Taiwan. So if there's an invasion, whoopsies, there goes the US's advantage there. So I think it would make sense to have a more secured supply chain. Maybe other allies, for instance, could start doing domestic manufacturing themselves too, if the US would do less. But I would separate between the CHIPS Act as implemented and a broader push to try and increase supply chain robustness. I think that's what a lot of the Trump administration is actually focusing quite a bit on, reducing economic interdependence on key things there. So that could be possible. But I mean, the CHIPS Act, for instance, didn't actually focus on AI chips that much. A lot of that money went to Intel, which doesn't even make serious AI chips. So it was largely a reaction to COVID, where supply chains got messed up, where chip supply chains got messed up. But I'm talking about targeting things on AI chip in particular. And I think there might be more that might become more salient, and there might be more possibility. But yeah, that'll be important. Otherwise, it's 20% plus chance that they invade this decade, according to many forecasters. So some put it higher. So that's kind of a clear loss condition that we're sleepwalking into. So I should hope that something's done about it. We're not really good at risk management.
Well, speaking of nightmare scenarios, folks are probably familiar with your name as the executive director for the Center for AI Safety, and you all have done a lot of work spreading awareness of potential catastrophic and existential risks posed by AI. I'm curious, we're in 2025, 3 years removed from the sort of ChatGPT moment. Are you sleeping better at night or worse at night? Are you more panicky? How have things evolved over time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or I think it's been 2 years, but it's a great question. I think there's more of a strategy now, so that's nice. I think overall, things considered speaking, I don't know, maybe I'd be more like, if this is, a catastrophe or ends up extremely poorly for all of us or something, maybe I'll put that at more like 50-50 as opposed to like 80% as it was some years ago. Yeah, but I think we'll gain substantial information even in the next months of how this is going to be shaking out in terms of the capabilities of these AI systems with this new reasoning paradigm. Much faster rate of development than with the previous generation. So we'll see if there start to be some substantial economic impacts on software development this year, and that could really affect the conversation a lot. So so the estimate I give is has high uncertainty, and a lot can change and will change quickly.
And before we let you go, talk more about these important new strategies and frameworks. I'm curious if we see Congress struggle to pass meaningful legislation around some of these key risks. Do you continue to think that states have a role in maybe putting in some more robust safeguards, just with respect to the things you emphasized earlier about just even week-long testing of a model to ensure certain capabilities aren't too likely?
I think most of the risk reduction will come actually at this international or geopolitical level. And I'm not necessarily meaning through like the UN, but just like the US and China and Russia, and their sort of dynamics and whether they stabilize things. So one won't be bottlenecked by Congress for this. There still would be useful basic stuff like reporting what the capabilities are to the government. I mean, I think it'd be very difficult. Imagine being in the Situation Room and you got news from CIA that, China has a new big project or something. You go, what should we do? And then they're like, well, where are our companies at? Well, I don't know. We stopped requiring that they tell us what's going on, 2 years ago. Okay, fantastic. That China probably has more insight as to what's going on at the AI companies than our own government. I think that could happen at the state level. I think even Congress requiring that whatever you're reporting to the EU, you also report to us. Wherever you're reporting to foreign governments, you report to us. Seems pretty reasonable to me. But obviously, some political factions will say this is you're trying to take over the world or something. Just something hyperbolic like that by him and some basic information stuff. So, but that could be done through other means. You wouldn't necessarily need Congress for this sort of reporting. So, like through the Defense Production Act, I think many of them would give it willingly, but there's just even having the appropriate agencies asking for it. But I don't think, I think that there is a distraction, or people are really fixated on the AI companies for affecting this. But I view them as basically most of their actions and behaviors are roughly predetermined by their overwhelming incentives and competitive pressures. So they should be like, you should think that they're going to spend 90+% of their resources and effort on securing a next huge race so that they can buy more compute. And that's their primary activity. Whatever's required for that, they're solving for X, whatever lets them raise that amount. That's their main objective. And then there's some safety noises that some will make along the way in varying degrees, but those won't really make much of a difference. So I think people get very fixated on performative safety things like, they put out more safety research, more safety blog posts. These don't actually make much of a difference. What make a difference is whether states deter each other from the superintelligence type of stuff. Which countries have an edge in AI, like supply chain ones, if they have guaranteed supply chains or not. And if we limit proliferation of potentially catastrophic dual-use capabilities to rogue actors. I think that's a much higher thing. So there's some role for the companies to play, but it kind of feels like TMZ or something like that, where it's like some celebrity things of Demis versus Sam versus da-da-da-da. This is not, they do not have much ability to act otherwise. They're very constrained by competitive pressures. Their personalities are interesting, but they can't go up against those competitive pressures in any very substantial way. So view it as largely preset.
Yeah, it draws to mind the idea of the transparency reports released by social media companies. Isn't exactly changing the game from a content moderation standpoint.
Yeah, they've got a better filter on their cigarettes or something like that. So they're the good one. I think people, in terms of their pressure, they should be getting on their governments to get on top of this. That's really instead of whining at OpenAI or wherever, to DeepMind, Anthropic, XAI, et cetera, to do more safety stuff or something, which maybe they'll allocate 1% more or of their budget at best. If they pressure their governments to, hey, you guys can kind of sleep at the wheel here, and you should get on top of this. That I think would be a more effective thing to push for if people are thinking to do advocacy.
All right, folks. Well, you've got your homework from Dan. Go get it, and hopefully he'll give you a good grade. But for now, Dan, we'll have to let you go. Thanks again for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me. The paper is at nationalsecurity.ai.
And we will be sure to include that in the show notes. Until next time, folks. The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter at our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Allies, The Aftermath, and Escalation, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series about the war in Ukraine. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Pacha. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thank you for listening.